over a period of 5 years. The central bank could delay it if they said for monetary policy reasons. At the end of 5 years, in point of fact, as we know now, 90% of the Mexican financial sector is foreign owned. And when I did a small study of the NAFTA effects at a given point, what I discovered was that credit as a share of GDP in Mexico never regained the level of 1994. And indeed, toward the end of the decade of the 90s, you had a situation in which there was negative credit. Why? Because the foreign banks were concerned about their shareholders. They were only going to lend for exports only if they could earn the foreign currency that they could then send home in the form of dividends, et cetera. So these are some of the patterns. Now we get to not finally by any means, but we get to long-term capital management and we see the carry trade in action. We don't know how much is involved. There are no statistics. This is an absolutely opaque market. Nobody reports adequately, et cetera. But one of the telling things about the collapse of long-term capital management was the collapse of the yen. The yen-dollar carry trade at that time with the yen as the funding currency at very low interest rates and the dollar as the investment currency. When you make the switch, you depress the funding currency, which the Japanese liked very well, thank you, and you raise the value of the investment currency, being the dollar, which Robert Rubin liked very well, who was at that point very powerful in the Clinton administration. So you had that game going on. One day in October, after a long-term capital management collapsed, you had the yen go up in value 7%, and then 17% by the end of 1998. So we know then how large the speculative activity was. They were chastened for a bit because people did lose money, but the carry trade, of course, then took off once again and in different directions, and by the time we're talking 2005, the carry trade is into the periphery, if we call it that, into the emerging markets as well. We should have known when long-term capital management collapsed just how much leverage there was in the system. We discovered that they were borrowing from at least 13 institutions that we knew of, that their leverage was about $100 for every $1 of capital. So then another very important thing begins to happen in this global economy. The financial sector has learned how to monetize debt, to create liquidity, to take on the role, if you will, that central banks should have. Now, how does that go? It means that a hedge fund or a hedge fund operation of Goldman Sachs or of JP Morgan borrows a certain amount of money, pledging securities against it. Those securities are on its balance sheet. Then it goes and takes what it has borrowed and buys more assets and pledges those against further borrowing. And so it goes up and up and up. And we create a bubble of debt in the financial sector. Financial sector debt in the United States went from about 63% of GDP in 1997 to 113% in 2007. The Bank of England recently put out a report saying, my God, we looked at our balance sheets of our banks and they rose threefold from 2001 to 2007. So we had, and we know what Iceland was doing, et cetera. So what we know is that leverage and this kind of liquidity creation that was going on was very much at the root of the crisis. I'm not going to talk about the subprime or the housing. That was the card they were playing as opposed to foreign exchange, whatever that they could do. They always pulled in a vulnerable sector, being it developing countries or households or whatever, all of whom in the end took the brunt of the collapse as well. Now, the very last minute or two of my time, I just want to say we could change all this. we could do a lot of things that we need to do. We could regulate the system, and that's my day job, which is to figure out, what do you need in terms of legislation? What reforms are actually needed to go into place to stop this game, which Jose Antonio, who is not here tonight, once said, I just think that the carry trade will go on forever, because, of course, nothing will stop it. And he fears for the emerging economies, and rightly so. But I think we have to fear for countries like Greece as well over time, et cetera. But we could, if we had the political will, there are things we could do to change all of that. I don't know that we have the political will. And I think we also have to look very broadly at this and deal with our own central bank as well. We have had people say that how well they managed the crisis. Nonsense. They did not. And what they're doing now is totally unconscionable. They lost control of their policy tool, which is the federal funds rate. They recognize that they have, and now they're looking for a new benchmark. They've decided that the interest rate on reserves will be the new interest rate benchmark, and they'll go back to the old system of doing monetary policy by interest rates, which can only affect demand. It does not affect supply, and they are unwilling to go there. There's no vision, there's no thoughtfulness in the Fed, and the problem is that having agreed and gotten the Congress to agree to pay interest on reserves, there is $1 trillion of reserves sitting there unused in the Federal Reserve System. It's not going to get used because in a financial sector that has moved from bank-based to market-based, where the terror is that you're going to have to mark something to market, and that will then take a charge against your capital. The banks are very happy to sit there with however low but still earning asset on their balance sheet, which is at face value. And there's nothing else in the system at this moment that is at face value. Therefore, they're not going to use it. Now, the global economy and the US economy desperately needs credit. It is true that there are not a lot of worthy borrowers, and we don't necessarily want it to go back into consumption. We don't want to reinvent that old wheel and have it break again. But we need the kind of working capital the small businesses need, on the one hand, and we desperately need trade credit for all the reasons that Jomo and others have talked about today, and as the transmission effect for the emerging economies, the absence of trade credit. So what would I suggest? Well, somebody earlier today said, why isn't the government creating jobs? And I say, having my first study was on the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, why isn't the government making direct loans? Why don't we revive credit in the way that it needs to be done and let the financial system, the oligopoly, the 6 institutions now that dominate the system, let them go. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Our last speaker tonight will be Jeff Madrick. He is a senior fellow at the New School Economic Department, SIPA, the Economic Policy Institute, and at the Roosevelt Institute. He is a journalist and author and editor of Challenge magazine, and again, an extremely prolific writer. And he has published a large number of articles and is, among others, a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and the New York Times. He has written several books also. The most recent one is The Case for Big Government, and he's in the process of finishing The Age of Greed. And Jeff will speak tonight on the difference between wage stagnation and inequality in the US, and what this differentiation means for the crisis, I believe.
I'm delighted to be here, Miriam. Thanks so much. Is that your phone or mine? That was my phone, by the way, making that noise. I didn't know how to turn it off. That's time to us. I'm delighted to be here. I wasn't aware. I'd been associated with the New School, I don't know, for years, and it shows you how negligent I am. I wasn't aware that you guys did this. It looks like quite a conference. I guess I shouldn't be admitting that. So thank you for inviting me. Let me say right